Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Boulder Ecosystem Summit 2020. I recognize that the University of Colorado Boulder sits upon land within the territories of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. Further, I acknowledge that 48 contemporary tribal nations are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. Good morning, I'm Sharon Collins. I'm a professor of environmental studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you today to our webinar, which is the first of 3 sessions this week that we are hosting that comprise this year's Boulder Ecosystem Summit. These sessions will focus on the recently launched Boulder Ecosystem Trends Report. We're thrilled that you have chosen to participate today, and we look forward to an active and constructive dialogue with you as we delve into understanding our local ecosystems from a variety of perspectives. I'd like to now introduce Amanda Carrico, who's the Interim Director of the Center for Sustainable Landscapes and Communities here at CU Boulder, and my colleague in the Environmental Studies program. Amanda?
Hello, thank you. Thank you, Sharon, and it's great to be with you today. And it's really my pleasure to welcome you here this morning for the launch of what's the first of 3 meetings associated with this year's Ecosystem Summit, where we're going to have the really great opportunity to hear from an exceptional panel of panelists of experts about climate change impacts and soil health in our community, and also importantly to discuss your questions about these issues. So we're grateful that you're here, and we look forward to engaging in this discussion. Before we get started, I'd like to take just a minute to introduce the Center for Sustainable Landscapes and Communities and to say a little bit about who we are and what we do as a center. We're a center that lives at CU Boulder, but that should probably be better described as a cross-sector partnership of concerned organizations and citizens in the Boulder area. Our affiliates include faculty, students, and staff at the university, as well as several local agencies, including Boulder County Parks and Open Space, several divisions within the city of Boulder, the Boulder Watershed Collective, and a whole host of other partners that I can't go into, can't mention all of them today, but Sharon's showing you a slide that lists our various partnering organizations. We're also made stronger by the participation of many engaged local residents and leaders in the community. So this event that you're participating in tonight represents one of many, this morning, represents one of many ongoing initiatives of the center that is designed to engage our community in respectful and productive discussion about the health and stewardship of our natural resources in Boulder. I encourage you to check out our website to learn about other activities that we are organizing and what we do across the many ongoing projects that we have. And if you'd like to receive notifications about our events, you can sign up to our mailing list through the center's website. Finally, I want to just take a minute to note that we are very fortunate to receive support through countless hours of dedicated volunteers that we do rely heavily on. We also rely heavily on the donations of concerned members of the Boulder community like yourself. So if you enjoy and benefit from this event or other events, please consider making a donation to the center so that we can continue this important work. 100% of these donations feed back into supporting the cost of research and for organizing open and accessible events like the one you're participating in today, and that serve our local community. So if you'd like to make a donation, you can find a link on our website to do that. And again, we're truly grateful for your support, whether that be monetary or simply by participating constructively in these important discussions. And to that end, I'm really grateful for your participation today. I'd like to thank our panelists again for being here, who you'll be introduced to in just a moment, and to the many talented individuals that have contributed to this year's Ecosystems Report and the summit that you're part of today. So I truly hope that you enjoy the program, and thank you very much for being with us. Thanks, Sharon.
Thank you, Amanda. So what I'm showing you on screen right now is essentially the front page of the Ecosystem Trends Report. We intentionally produced this report in a digital format only, so it's accessible from our website, cslc.colorado.edu, as Amanda just mentioned, and it's also available as a downloadable PDF. So if you click on the Executive Summary tab in this digital form, you will be taken down to a place where you can download the report after you answer just a few questions about who you are and how you might use the report. And that's especially important for our research on how people will be using this information. So if I click on About the Report here, you'll see some information about why we are doing this report and what are some of the important aspects of the report. Also, who is responsible for putting this report together. So I want to start there. I want to thank our funders, and the project was funded by a collective of City and County of Boulder offices, as well as the Community Foundation Boulder County. So I'd like to especially thank Therese Glowicki, Brett Kincairn, and Chris Barge, who were responsible for bringing this support together, and also acknowledge the support of the Environmental Studies program and the College of Arts and Sciences at CU Boulder. As you might imagine, if you've taken a look at this report, many people contributed time and expertise and energy, and importantly, data to this effort. And so here we have the project contributors, and you can see a long list. Thank you all so much for participating in this effort and for bringing your knowledge and information to this project. I'd like to especially thank also the Center for Sustainable Landscapes and Communities Advisory Board, and Amanda Carrico, the interim director, and Aaron Freed, our outreach and research coordinator, who's done a fantastic job marketing this event and letting you all know about it. And finally, a huge thanks down here to our project team, Karen Bailey, Raina Benzeev, Sarah Jaffe, and Kika Tuff. These folks have done an incredible job putting this information together, analyzing and visualizing data. And then Kika Tuff is our master scientist storyteller who was responsible for the design and the implementation of the report. So thanks to this incredible team. So let's go back up and just for a moment, look at why we did this report. We believe that there's a critical need for all of us here in Boulder County to understand how our ecosystems are changing in order to promote positive actions for the future of our local landscapes and communities. And so the center collaborated a couple of years ago with Brett Kincairn at the City of Boulder's Climate Initiatives Division to plan and host a one-day gathering on cities, ecosystems, and climate change. Maybe many of you participated in that event. It was very successful, and out of that came a motivation and an interest in understanding our local ecosystems. And I really want to thank Brett Kincairn here, who you'll meet in just a moment, who brought this idea to me about 18 months ago and said, you know, it'd be nice to have some sort of way to track changes in our local landscapes. And so that's how this idea was born. So through several public gatherings in 2019 and 2020, we brought together students, faculty, advisors, community stakeholders to identify the types and sources of data that we have available to us in our community that are relevant to understanding current ecosystem status and trends. So we started with a very long list of potential trends. Those were vetted through community members, local land management staff, with the end result of a prioritized list of 6 categories of data types to be collated and synthesized for this first ever ecosystem trends report. So these 6 trend categories were chosen based on a number of criteria: their relevance to local policy and management, the availability of high quality data sources to inform the trend, and their direct impact on tracking environmental change. The 6 categories of trends we identified for this 2020 report are climate, soil health, watershed health, air quality, biodiversity, and urban land cover. And so today's session is focused on those first 2, climate and soil health. For each of these trend categories, our project team identified and wrote 3 stories. Each of these stories provides information and data on the specific trends, and importantly, recommendations for actions that you can take as community members to be involved in either collecting data or taking action that will mitigate some of the negative consequences of these trends. We'd love to have this opportunity today and in the 2 sessions that follow this week to hear from you about what you think are the important trends we should be tracking, how we can begin to develop a more holistic and full understanding of our communities and how they're changing. So after this introduction, which I'm nearly finished with, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for today, which is Brett Kincairn, who will spend about 20 minutes walking you through the 6 stories on climate and soil health that are the focus of today's session. And then we'll have a chance to hear from our invited guests. We have 5 invited guests today. to get their take on what they see in these trends and how they interpret the findings. That'll take us about halfway through our webinar. At the halfway point, we'll administer a quick online survey to all of you just to get a sense of why you're here, what you want to learn more about, and how you might use the report. And this is an important piece of our effort to understand and conduct research on how information is used by communities in decision making. After the survey, we'll open up the webinar for questions, insights, comments, suggestions from the audience, and these will be fielded by me and by our moderator and may be directed to specific guests or to the group in general. During the webinar, we'll be posting on social media, both on Instagram and Twitter, so please feel free to join us using the hashtag Boulder Ecosystem Summit. And I'll put that in the chat in just a moment. So thank you all again for being here. I really am so excited to see over 100 people on this webinar today. And thanks to all of you who've been involved in this effort. It's really been a tremendous experience over the past few months. So I'll turn it over now to Brett Kincairn, who is the Senior Policy Advisor for Climate, Sustainability, and Resilience at the City of Boulder Climate Initiatives Division. Thanks so much, Brett.
Thank you, Sharon. I have been looking forward to this day for a long time, and I just want to really begin by offering a huge amount of gratitude to Sharon and to all the people in the Center for Sustainable Landscapes and Communities. I think, as we all know, living in a city that's blessed to have a premier academic institution like CU, that nonetheless, sometimes these worlds can live in parallel and not intersect as much as we would like. And that happens a lot, especially in the context of local city government and university operations, that we don't often have a lot of interaction. You know, there are clearly questions that we have in terms of how do you do things on a day-to-day basis that we're interested in getting feedback from the university researchers about, but a lot of times those things don't mesh. So sometimes that's frustrating, but sometimes it's enormously rewarding when you put the time and effort in, and when there are people at the university who really step forward and say, yes, let's figure out how we can bring these remarkable minds and resources that we have in our academic institution into service of our community. And that's what Sharon and the center have really done in this effort. As Sharon said, this all started as an idea back in 2017-18, as we were starting to think about what the likely changes might be in our ecosystems associated with climate change. We knew we did not have enough information about that, especially as we started to see the likelihood of climate change intensifying start to occur. And so it's been very, frankly, reassuring to have this sort of academic foundation now at our backs, trying to help us to figure out how to live through these incredible times that we're living through. So before I say anything more, though, I do want to make sure I introduce our remarkable cast of panelists that we've brought today. So if you could all just come on briefly and I'll introduce you here. So Matt Kelsch is a senior researcher at the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research, UCAR, one of the federal labs that exists here in Boulder. And he'll give us his insights, having been one of the people who literally has been gathering weather data for us for the last 30 years on some of the trends we're seeing. Elizabeth Black, who is the founder of the Citizens Science Soil Health Project, a dear friend and a person that I both admire and try to listen to as much as possible, a real sort of leader in our community in terms of how we're thinking about working with the land, will be with us. Mara Rose, somebody I've just had the good fortune of meeting this year, who's launched a remarkable business now here in town called Boundless Landscapes, which is helping people transform their conventional lawns into productive landscapes that are feeding not only themselves, but other people in the community. And then this amazing graduate student team that I have truly been honored to work with this year from CU, that includes Natalie Shishido, Francis Otero, and Patrick Campbell, who spent the year working with us on thinking about a theme, frankly, that actually came out of the last Ecosystem Summit in 2018, when many, many of you said that one of the most important ecosystems issues locally was how we think about converting lawns into productive and sort of climate resilient landscapes. And they've been giving us some insights about that. All right, so I'm gonna now, you guys can take a little break, turn off your cameras. Sharon has given me the opportunity to reveal myself as what I truly am in the world, which is really, I'm mostly a storyteller in this work that we do, we're trying to sort of help make the world that we're living in comprehensible and figure out a path that we can go forward in. So I have this delightful task today of walking you briefly through this remarkable report that Sharon has introduced you to, which I want to just emphasize is just the beginning. As Sharon said, we selected these trends for a variety of reasons. Some of them were based on what we had data around. Some of them were based on things that we knew that were priorities. And we also knew that it was incomplete, and that part of what we're looking for from all of you is the feedback on what else we need to be watching as critical trends to know how our larger, more than human living community around us is doing. And so that's what this trends report is all about. So I'm going to start by pulling up that report. And so forgive me now, as all of you know, like we're in a brand new domain. This is the whole format of this gathering is brand new. And I would be remiss if I didn't say, part of the unique value of this kind of weird digital context that we're living in is that I get to say hello to my family directly. So to my daughter, Maggie, my son, Nathaniel, my wife, Emily, and probably our dog, Sophie. Hello, I hope you're watching out there somewhere in this weird world. Okay, so now I'm going to try to share screens and take you actually directly to the report itself. Let's see. Okay, yes, here we go. So I'm going to start in a little bit different format than the trends report shows. The trends report starts with the hail discussion and then goes to temperature and then goes to precipitation. But I want to start with heat first. And the reason I want to start there is because I think one of the things that we often don't think about in terms of this climate change context, because it gets very scientific and abstract very quickly, is what it's really all about. And really what climate change or the changing climate is about is that we've created a condition in our planet in which the planet is actually capturing more energy. What this greenhouse gas layer is doing is creating this little blanket that basically more energy is coming through than is bouncing back than before. And that's why we see warming. But that warming is just one aspect of the increase in energy that's now moving around in our system. As some of you might have been like me last night, sort of kept up by the wind. The wind is a part of that increase in the energy that is now moving through our system. But that one of the most identifiable markers of that increased energy in our system is the amount of heat that we're seeing and how those temperatures are changing. So this is from the report. This is this first section, hot days in Boulder, how it's getting hotter. So this is work that Matt can talk about in much greater detail. But part of what we're basically seeing is our temperatures are going up. And if you want to see the sort of indication of that, here are the average hot days, the days of over 90 in Boulder from 1990 to now. And you can see that dotted line showing us this trend. So we know that our days are getting hotter. Now, I think a lot of times we hear people talk about climate change in the context of, well, is it going to be 1 degree or 2 degrees or 3 degrees? And, I don't know about you, but sometimes I think, well, a couple of degrees warmer, that might be kind of nice. But it's actually not averages that get you in this situation. It's the extremes. And so one of the things that I wanted to just note is that it's the seasonal extremes, the days over 90, the amount of rain that falls in a greater intensities, that it's the extremes that get you, not the averages over year to year. But this data about days over 90 is very important. It's also about when that heat arrives. And so there's this fascinating depiction of heat and how we're starting to see more and more of these really hot days, especially in that period of time, as we remember from this summer, which was of course very hot, in that July, August, and now even into September timeframe. And as we know, as these days, as you can see in that September bar, as we start to see more hotter days later in the year, what that does is set up our conditions for the kinds of forest fires that unfortunately we've experienced this year as well. So that, of course, leads us to the kinds of impacts that we've seen and how incredibly significant that can be in the areas around us. I did want to just make this kind of even more sort of relevant for you in a way that perhaps you can talk to other people in your households about. And so I'm going to share some information that we developed a couple of years ago. And this is again related to information that was developed here at CU through the Western Water Assessment. Oops, I'm sorry. This was a report that was done in 2014. And again, this is showing what that average temperature increase is doing. And so you see all the red bars are days that are hotter. And then what this does is project it out into the future. And you start to see that by mid-century, we could be significantly hotter. Well, what does that mean to how do we describe that to our friends and relatives around the holiday tables? Well, this is historic Boulder, temperate. You know, they set up Chautauqua here in the Teachers College because it was a place that people could come in the summer times where it was much more temperate than places like Texas or the Southwest. Well, what the reality is, as we face these average temperature increases, that average drives an entire systems change. So what this report in 2014 said was that on average, we're likely to see, depending on the trajectory, how much emissions reduction we actually achieve, a temperature increase from somewhere between 2 degrees, which would mean that our climate would be much closer in resemblance to Pueblo, to 6 degrees, which would mean our climate would be much closer resembling Albuquerque. So if you wanted to describe to people what that means in terms of averages, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 6 degrees, this is a way that I've found actually is very helpful for people to understand. Now, clearly our landscape won't look exactly like Albuquerque at mid-century, but that is the trajectory. We will see dramatic ecological changes that accompany this gradual change in the average conditions. But it's also the extremes that are very important. This was work done by Paul Chanowski at CU Boulder, in which we looked at what would the extremes in the summertime likely be for a particular location. This was the East Boulder Rec. So this is at 2050. What would we likely be seeing in terms of the summer extremes? And it basically is saying our average extreme days in the summer could be anywhere from somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to even 12 degrees warmer than we're normally experiencing now. So that's why I'm saying it's not necessarily the averages that we need to worry about. It's really the extremes. So I'm going to go back now to the report. I think I'm going to go back to the report. Please let me go back to the report here. This is always the fun part about technology. The minute you try to deviate from anything that's sort of along here we go, the normal task. Okay, so that's temperature. Now, what about, as Sharon showed you, there's a lovely navigation in this. So we've just talked about the hot days. Let's talk about moisture. So we're going to go here now. So what we also know, and this is the interesting thing about this ecological area that we live in, you can't necessarily say, well, are we going to get drier or wetter? Because we live in this interface of plains and mountains, it's actually more likely that we're going to get both. We're going to get both drier and wetter in this kind of very intense oscillating set of extremes between them. And so this is very interesting information that shows the annual precipitation in Boulder from 1991 to today. So the red lines are the amount below average, the blue lines are the amount above. Anybody guess what that big tall blue line is there about 3/4 of the way to the right? Yeah, that's the floods in 2013. You'll see this in other data that we show here too. Here's in fact another way of showing this in that stacked diagram. So this is showing how much precipitation falls by month. Again, anybody want to guess what that dark blue, very intense precipitation event is in that September a few years back? Yep, that's the flood. So we're starting to see these extremes of when moisture comes, it comes in extreme amounts, but then we'll also experience these periods where it's very, very dry. And that is very difficult for our landscapes to actually tolerate. Often landscapes are developing, evolving, if you will, to be prepared for one type or another. And now we're going to be starting to see both. So let's talk now about that hail condition. As some of you know, I didn't know this until I saw the trends report, that Boulder County is considered in the hail capital of North America. So it's not uncommon for us to get hail in our area, but what is starting to be uncommon is both the size, intensity, and frequency. So this is a graph from within the report that shows how frequent these hail events are across the different cities in our county. The numbers there are pretty obvious. You're starting to see these spikes that occur that also get higher. And so there's that period between 2015 and now where we've had a lot of hail events. And it's not just that we get more hail, it's that the hail itself is getting bigger. This really interesting visualization shows you the size of the hail. So each concentric circle shows the number of the amount of hail that's coming in that different size category. And as we're seeing, we're starting to get more of this hail that's in the sort of quarter size. And that's enough, as most of you know, to damage roofs and damage cars and do a lot of significant damage, of course, in our agricultural lands. We had a terrible hail event, I think it was earlier this year, that was just devastating for a lot of our local ag folks. So these are three of the trends that we're starting to see take place in the context of our changing climate. All right, now the second set of trends that we wanted to talk about are related to the soils. And so why soils? Why are we thinking about soils in this context? Well, soils in many ways are the sort of foundation. I'm just clicking through, and this is the way you can actually get through to other parts of the report. So I'm going to click down now to the section on soils and plants. You can think about soils as kind of like the great intermediary between us and climate. It's where sort of all of the rubber hits the road, if you will, between the energy that's available in our larger system, from the sun, from the wind, to the kinds of things that we need: food, fiber, shelter. And if our soils are healthy, they can provide a lot of those services, and including keeping the plants alive that are providing air quality and water filtration, infiltration, and all that. When we start to lose our soils, our larger ecological systems start to unravel. So watching the characteristics and the health of our soils is especially important. It's also an area that, frankly, we haven't had very much information on. But despite the fact that there are soil maps that have been in place across the United States for almost 100 years, we have not actually had a uniform soil health assessment of soils across our systems ever. And so Boulder is really leading in many ways to start to develop this kind of common standard of soil health, so that we can watch that trend and so we can figure out ways to practice soil stewardship in manners that improve the condition of our soils, as we'll get to in a second. So one of the places we wanted to start, though, was in native ecosystems. And so we've through the Department of Open Space and Mountain Parks at the city, we have launched a set of research to look at what the carbon storage is in soils based on different plant communities. And this resulted already in some very interesting findings. So we're looking at three different types of native grass species systems in our area. And these, by the way, are described a little bit further down in the report, which is a really fun way. Like, sometimes when I go walking in OSMP parklands, I don't really realize that I'm walking through very different grasslands than in another place in the system. And so this will give you some sense of the difference between, say, a mesic, sort of a mixed bluegrass, blue big stem prairie grass, to a mixed grass, to a xeric, that's xeric meaning a sort of drought tolerant grass. And basically the finding of this part of the study was that the more diversity we have in the terms of the species that exist within each of these different communities, the more carbon that community of plants is able to capture and store in the ground. And one way to think about carbon in the soil is that it's essentially the fuel stocks. It is the energy reserves, essentially, of all life. And therefore, the more energy we can invest in, put into the soil through our plants, the more energy there is to maintain all the things that we want those systems to provide. And so what we found, perhaps not surprisingly, but now we have the research to show it, is that more diverse, species-rich environments can capture and hold more carbon. Well, now let's talk about how we're actually managing carbon in our actual farm context. And this is where some of the work that both our new soil health coordinator, Lauren Kolb at the city, and also this remarkable work that Elizabeth Black has been doing with local farmers comes into play. Well, we're starting to get folks to do shared soil data gathering using the same formats, so we can start to compare across different practices and simply learn what's working, what's not working, what's causing different effects that we did or didn't know about. And one of the things that we've discovered through this work, especially through Elizabeth's work, is that soil phosphorus levels are actually getting to dangerously high levels because of certain practices. And one of those practices, as it turns out, is in the use of manure. So in the context of organic agriculture, one of the things that those farmers are trying to do is to avoid the use of synthetic pesticides and fertilizers. But one of the things that they would substitute instead of a synthetic fertilizer is manure. And that manure often brings a very high level of phosphorus into the soil in addition to the nitrogen that the farmers are often after. And this graph shows that, in fact, across the individual farms in Boulder County, it's a whole bunch of the organic farms that are showing these very high phosphorus levels. Now, that's not to deride those farmers at all. They're doing what they know how to do right now. And our work now is to help work with them to find new ways of getting those natural organic resources that they need, especially like nitrogen, without bringing with it all of that phosphorus. So these are trends that we didn't even know existed until we started to gather this data. Now, this is why this kind of citizen soil monitoring is so important. There's no way that the city or any other public entity actually has the resources to go out and gather all that information. And so it's been exciting and frankly, a part of the Boulder legacy of kind of learning, pioneering, trying new things, that we have a whole bunch of these farmers and others in our community that are out there gathering this information. And at this moment, I also want to make sure that I do a shout out to EcoCycle, who has a sort of related project called the Backyard Carbon Farming Campaign. They also are taking up folks who are interested in learning about this and starting to do soil monitoring in their own backyards. And they're using the same format of data gathering that we're using in these other places so that all that data can be compared. Okay, the last trend we wanted to look at here was in tillage practices. And this is a very important insight that I think has been emerging across agriculture broadly, but that we're certainly seeing as true in the context of the Boulder County area, which is that the more you disturb, and especially the more you break and expose soil to the elements, the more it starts to degrade. And so this analysis looked at how tillage practices are affecting soil health and soil carbon. And so not so very surprising, what we're finding is that in that context, the less you till, the more carbon you have in your soils. And again, the more carbon, think about that as the more energy and the more sort of energetic capacity that soil has to support life in all kinds of different ways. So we've known that low tillage or no tillage was important. I think this data is starting to help us see how significant that is and how there are some real champions in our community. In fact, I think more than half of the lands that we're managing right now are actually in a low or no till context. Because in part, though, I should note, a lot of that is in grazing and other types of activities that we wouldn't normally be tilling soil in. So this is all just pointing to this value of us starting to understand what the context of these different ecosystems are, and then finding ways that we can work and support with those who are our land stewards to find ways to improve all of that. So I would just, again, refer all of you to this trends report. There's so much rich data here, and it's, I think, very insightful. And there are lots of ways that we can start to think about involving everyone in this process. And we'll get to that as we now go into the questions and answers period. So anyway, that's the last of the 6 trends that I wanted to do a little storytelling about. And with that, I'd like to invite our panelists to join in this process. I'll stop sharing my screen. Oh, I guess one last thing I want to just share one last little bit of screen here for you. And please do everybody come on, but I wanted to just show these last 2 slides. Just to show you that this work has such potential transformative effect. This is a picture of my son, Nathaniel, standing on one of the city's open space agricultural properties back in the spring of 2018, just as we were starting to really come to grips with how significant the soil loss and the soil degradation has started to be in our area and even on our own lands. And this was a site that, through a combination of many different factors, past management practices, climate change, the sort of unceasing grazing impacts of prairie dogs, this site had basically lost not only all of its topsoil, it had lost all of its A-horizon. That's just gravelly soil that you're seeing there that's Nathaniel standing on. And that was the point at which we started to try to launch some efforts and research to figure out what we could do about that. And that the exciting thing was then just even later that year, as we started to introduce things like keyline plowing and compost and biochar and a whole bunch of other things, we started to see the inherent resilience capabilities of these natural systems to respond. Now we've had our ups and downs since that time. We've lost some of the progress we've made. We're starting to figure out ways that we can sustain that. But just to say that when we turn our attention and our cooperative support to the landscapes, it can do really remarkable things. So with that, I now look forward to this conversation with our panelists. So Matt, let me start with you. First of all, it's so fun to live in a community which literally has something like 3,000 climate scientists in it. So, you know, they say you can't throw a rock and not hit either a therapist or a climate scientist in Boulder. So we'll be talking about, in fact, we maybe should get the therapist on later to talk about the trauma of all this. But today I want to make sure we give our climate scientists a chance to just underscore, Matt, what you think some of the key findings are and how we relate to that in our own personal lives. I mentioned this issue about not trying to understand this just in terms of averages, but how do you describe this set of changes to people when you're talking to them?
Well, first, I want to remind everyone that Boulder County is a tiny part of the world. So when we're talking about global climate change, it's important to see how we are consistent with the rest of the world. So when we see an increase in extreme events, both in the dry and wet, that September 2013 event doesn't itself prove climate change, but when it's put in the context that around the world, we're seeing more extreme highs and lows, those are the kinds of trends we're expecting to see around the world. So that's just one data point in the bigger picture. The 30-year climatology that we have is a small part of Boulder's longer climate record, which goes back to 1897. But prior to 1990, Boulder has a really unsatisfactory climate record. The station moved around about every 10 years and it was on the rooftop, which gives a warm bias to the temperatures. There was a lot of missing data. So this period of 1991 to 2020 will be the first 30-year climatology Boulder has in its long record. And the reason why that's important is 30 years is kind of considered the standard. We're using standard instrumentation and location and all that, where we can now start comparing with other stations when we're studying climate. Until now, Boulder is not a station that's ever used in climate studies because of the poor quality of its pre-1990 climate record.
That's great. And I think it's exciting, once again, that we get to participate, not just in our own community in a sense, but in this international context. Elizabeth, I wanted to turn to you, and I just, again, want to commend you for, I personally know how hard you've worked to create this Citizen Soil Health project and how difficult it is to get people to be willing to collaborate and trust and share information. And so, you know, thank you so much for that. What are some of the sort of unexpected insights that you think have come forward? And I know that the data is this is very early in the process, but what are some of the unexpected insights, and what are some of the key things that this is really pointing to as places that we need to focus more attention? You're muted.
One of the surprising insights for me was that it didn't, organic or conventional methods do not really make any difference at all in terms of soil health, at least in our data. Our organic sites and our conventional sites ended up having the same median soil health score. There was a range of soil health scores for organic and for conventional, but when you compared the medians of the two groups, they were exactly the same. However, if you looked at tillage practices, that's where we really saw the big difference. And I think that helps to explain why organic and conventional growers end up being quite similar, because organic growers, although they may add more organic material and use different organic practices, they depend a lot on conventional tillage to control weeds and to incorporate material and to do planting. And so that ends up evening out the two groups in terms of their soil health, because organic growers depend so much on tillage. The other big surprise for me is what a big difference water makes in terms of soil health. When I compared our different tillage groups, the guys who were irrigated with the guys who were not irrigated, who were dry land, in say the zero tillage group or the conventional tillage group, everyone who had water had higher soil health scores than people who did not have water. And that makes perfect sense. Water is life for us and also for soil microbial life. And those little microbes, if they have plentiful water, are able to sequester more carbon. So, and make the soil healthier. So that, that makes a lot of sense when you think about it. In terms of what we need to pay more attention to, I think, a water person says we need to maximize the beneficial use of our limited water resources, which is exactly what this report says. And it means putting money into our water infrastructure, our ag water infrastructure, so that we can take the very limited water we have in this, arid desert West and make it go further and make it be stretched further on more lands so that we can get water onto more lands more efficiently. And I guess the other thing we need to look at is the effect of animals. We've been tracking that. Right now, cows are not PC at all, but they're the closest thing we have to buffaloes, which helped to build this really rich plains soil that is here on the Great Plains. And how can we minimize some of the detrimental effects of cows, but maximize their beneficial use in terms of getting more increasing the soil health of our lands. And then cover crops and reduced tillage are another thing that we really want to look into. And that ends up going back to the subject of water. To get a cover crop to grow here, you need water in the fall. And that's when our water resources start getting pretty thin. I guess that's the main thing.
Good. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And lots to dig into there. I just personally would note I'm very interested in the sort of microbial life in the conventional versus organics and whether we could pull anything out about that in the data we've got so far. So Mara, let me turn to you. So often I think in this sort of growing awareness that land is important in terms of climate change and that we should be doing land practices that help us stabilize climate, then we only think about like large forests, large range, large ag. But here you are working on essentially agriculture inside the city. Why is that relevant, and how do you think that's an important trend that we should be watching? And
yeah, well, first, thank you for including us here. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation, and it's been wonderful hearing what everyone else has to say. A lot of times, so we convert lawns and other underutilized spaces into thriving food gardens, but really the hope is that we're converting them into thriving soil gardens. So as much as we're growing food, we're growing hopefully healthy soil. And I think one of the exciting things is we have all this land in the city that can be doing that and can be put to use in that way. One might argue in using that land in a wiser way when it comes to water, when it comes to carbon sequestration, and the health of the environment. But I think what's exciting about bringing it into communities is that it also just increases awareness and consciousness. So it becomes an educational tool as much as it becomes a tool for creating environmental change. And so the homeowners and the residents that we've worked with suddenly get, a bird's eye view, up close view of what it looks like to tend soil. And they're engaged in the practices. So when we were preparing to winterize all of our gardens and we were going to cover crop them and sheet mulch them, we got to send notes out to all of the folks who live in the homes where we're working and explain what we're doing and why we're doing it and what that does to build healthier, more richer soil, and then ultimately how that translates into healthier, more nutrient-dense food. And so I think it begins to place individual residents into this context in a really rich and exciting way that then gets them invested in it more and more. And so I think that's one way in which it's relevant. And I think there's just, and I'm just so excited about Elizabeth's work and for us to learn as much as possible and to continue to adapt our practices in alignment with it. But, you know, we have been very deliberate in developing farming practices that are, again, oriented towards growing healthy soil. And so and I think the things that we do are things that homeowners and residents all over Boulder can do, whether they're, you know, partnering with us or just doing it on their own. So again, and I think some of those practices require a real shift in aesthetic preferences, ideas of what beauty is. You know, so one thing is minimally weeding, right? So when you weed less, you disturb the soil less, but your neighbors might also be less excited about your garden. And so how can we begin to educate people about these sorts of practices and reorient them towards what is beautiful and what the benefits of different activities are? So whether it's cover cropping, minimally weeding, sheet mulching, and, you know, sometimes when you sheet mulch, you're going to layer cardboard and leaves and wood chips and things like that all on top of each other. And maybe that cardboard will peek out from underneath and look a little less attractive. But if you know that it's actually building soil, and that soil as it builds will retain water better and actually contribute to this very virtuous cycle, maybe you'll be more accepting of that. So I don't know if that answers your question, Brett, but I think that those are some of the ways that we think about the importance of bringing it into the neighborhoods and inviting residents into sort of a hopeful perspective on how they can be a part of the solution, even on a micro level.
No, I love this. And again, I think it's very interesting that when we had this summit 2 years ago, and just so everybody on this call knows, one of the things that I'm so grateful to Sharon and her team for is that they've committed to not only hosting this year's summit, but the idea is to have this summit every 2 years so that we can keep checking in. And then in the meantime, have this important research being done and reported out by the Community Foundation about how we're doing on these ecological trends. So 2 years ago, when we asked people, what's your big ideal? What's the thing we should be focusing on? I think that one of the most repeated themes was this issue of like, I want to do something about my lawn, but I don't know what to do. So I love that you're creating that pathway for folks individually. But there might still be those who say like, okay, how important really is this? Like, how much impact does that really have? And I think that's where the work of this next team is really interesting. So I'm going to sort of tee up a 3-part question for my colleagues from the CU Master's Program. First of all, so Patrick, like, how relevant is this in terms of the ecosystem services that these landscapes provide? Like, does this really matter? So Natalie, for you, like, what do we know about what people care about? I know you've done some survey work with the different folks in the community. So what have we heard from that? And finally, so, okay, may we decide that this is all very valuable, but isn't it going to necessarily be because individuals themselves do this entirely? What about that industry that provides landscaping services? So Francis, I'd love for you to talk just a little bit about what we've learned about what the landscaping industry thinks about all this. So Patrick?
Hi, thanks, Brett. So current landscaping management in Boulder, both residential practices and industry practices, they really rely on heavy water use for grass lawns. And these grass lawns are quite void of biodiversity and provide minimal co-benefits for environmental and human health. And these co-benefits are precisely what we need to maximize our resilience and capacity to climate shocks. We've been learning from interviews with industry professionals and surveys from residents that these urban landscapes, they're really requiring a lot of this water use. And so we've been looking to municipal levers that we can use to decrease this water through landscape transitions, very similar to what Mara just talked about. And our project is really heavily based in indicators from Boulder's Climate, Ecosystems, and Community report that came out a few years ago. And this says that our tree canopy cover is declining, our soil health in urban areas is heavily impacted by chemical use, and our pollinator population is decreasing that connects our urban center to these agricultural lands. And so these are all the elements in our urban ecosystem that we need to build resilience to climate shock, and management with them is really key. There's like Mara said, over 30,000 acres of residential yard space that can be leveraged for this change. And many cities in the American West are already implementing a lot of these landscape-based solutions that maximize our ecosystem services for co-benefits of the environment and human health. And I think these case studies from other cities are at City of Boulder's disposal to explore different municipal programs we can use to enhance these ecosystem services.
Natalie?
Yeah, and I think this is not to say that Boulder is completely devoid of these landscapes that we're trying to see with regenerative practices. I think if you walk around neighborhoods, you'll see pollinator gardens and carbon farming and a lot of good stuff happening, but it's definitely not the predominant practice, right? And so even if we do have these, they're not widely adopted across Boulder. And so that was a large part of what we focused on in our project, was how to use these municipal levers to really change what is happening on a larger scale in Boulder, and maybe connect up some of these different projects that are happening across the city. So looking at municipal levers like policy and incentive programs, these ecosystem trends and the work that's been done here really helps to support and inform policy and incentive programs and build the case for what the city can be doing. Also generating demand among residents, that's something that we've talked about. Boulder might already have more demand than your average US city for sustainable landscaping practices or organic landscaping practices. But making sure we're connecting people up with the resources they need in order to be able to actually change things. So when we did survey some neighborhoods, we found that a lot of people were taking care of their own landscape. They weren't necessarily hiring out work, but in order to be able to change this predominant lawn landscape that we're seeing, people didn't really know where to turn or what the first step was, right? And so we also did some interviews with the landscaping professionals to try and understand what they're seeing on their side. And I can kind of turn it over to Frances. Frances did a lot of the interview work with our industry professionals in that area.
Yes, because we didn't have enough data and information about how the landscaping industry was doing in Boulder. We had to reach out to landscaping companies. So we conducted interviews with 6 landscaping companies. We understand that that's not a big sample representative of Boulder, but it gives us a better understanding than we had before about how the industry is performing locally. And so the companies that we interviewed, they had more than 20 years in business, which we consider that it was good. And what they told us about green landscaping is the industry, the overall, is performing very well. There's high demand for landscaping services. And there's increased local awareness and demand for sustainable practices. So people are asking for pollinator gardens, native plants, and water conservation alternatives, and to improve like soil health and things like that. And that is actually working well in the landscaping industry. But there are many barriers to implementing more green landscaping practices. So the industry is quite concerned about labor because labor is a problem, labor shortage. And they are also, in terms of green landscaping, they agree that demand for green landscaping services is fairly high and trending upwards. But there are challenges that have to be with the lack of effectiveness of organic products expensive labor because it's more, it requires way more labor. Taking care of a native plant garden requires more labor than just like mowing a lawn. And the costs of green services is another big one. And even though Boulder is a wealthy community, still for commercial customers and for HOAs that have limited budget, that's a big concern and a big barrier to implementing sustainable landscaping services. And of course, the aesthetic, the low tolerance that residents still have to looking at weeds, that's another big concern to implementing sustainable landscaping practices. So those were the themes that came up more frequently in our research and interviews.
Thank you, and thank you to that whole team again for the work you've done. So we're just a little past midpoint here. We're going to take this little bit of a break so that we can send this. We have you all participate in this very, very short, like 1 or 2 minute survey. This is also a chance to do a little bio break, but do the survey first. So we're going to take about 5 minutes to do this survey. Sharon, do you want to give folks the instruction for how that's going to take place? And then we're going to come back and get to the questions that are starting to come forward. So all of you who are participants, there's a question and answer button in your screens. You can start posting questions up there and we'll start directing those to the panelists.
Sure,
Sharon?
thanks, Brett. And so I just put into the chat for all of you a link to a very quick survey. And as we noted earlier, this is just to get a sense of who's participating in the webinar, who is interested in the report, and how you heard about it, and how you might use the report in your own work. So the link is there. Please let me know in the chat if you have, or sorry, in the question and answer if you have any trouble with that. And then, yes, if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box, which is accessible on your bar, your lower bar on your screen, Q&A. Just click on that and type in a question. Thanks so much.
So we'll give you about 3 minutes. We'll try to get started again on the questions here at about 11 straight up. So jump to that link, if you will, fill that out, and then we'll get started. All right, as folks are finishing up, you got a couple more minutes, but as you're finishing up, I again invite you to, if you haven't tried this, move your cursor over your screen and you should see a little menu bar down at the bottom. And there should be a Q&A button. If you have questions that you'd like to ask any of the panelists, you can type them into that and we will start scrolling through those. For the panelists, as I've mentioned to you, I welcome you looking through the questions too and seeing if there are any of those that you want to especially respond to. somebody has noted that the chat might be disabled. They wanted to go to get to the survey. So we might want to make sure they can still get to the chat and get to the survey.
Yes, Brett, I think that attendees are not able to type into the chat, but should be able to access the survey link. I will put it in again. Thanks.
All right, well, you can keep working on the survey if you still need to, and again, obviously feel free if you need a bio break or something, but we're gonna there's lots of good questions coming forward already. And I'm going to start directing a few of these to our esteemed panelists here. So one of our community members asked, what cities are good examples in the transitions of lawns? So Natalie, I know that you've done some case studies around that. Do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we see a lot of this work in the Southwest, especially because they are so water insecure. Phoenix and Las Vegas have done a really good job of providing incentive programs for residents to remove their lawns and replace it with, a lot of times it's xeriscaping, those types of landscaping, because they are in the desert, and that makes sense for those ecosystems. There's also programs in Colorado. I think Aurora has a lawn rebate program as well for removing your lawn. You get some sort of subsidy there, so to help cover the cost of transitioning away from your lawn. And then we also see some policy and ordinance both in Colorado and outside of Colorado. So Aspen has some water efficient landscaping standards that they've adopted into ordinance. And so that helps promote more effective water use within your landscape. And the Bay Area also does a really good job with their ordinances with regard to water efficiency. I also wanted to touch on the question about xeriscaping, because it kind of relates to what people are doing or what different cities are doing. Focusing on just water does help to kind of get this transition going, but it doesn't necessarily make sense for just for our area. If you're in Phoenix or Las Vegas, xeriscaping is a great option because you are in the desert. However, here we want to be seeing other types of landscaping that also support pollinator health and stormwater management and things like that.
Thank you, Natalie.
Could I also chime in?
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to mention we've been lucky enough to also be working with a team of grad students from CU Boulder's Masters of the Environment program, and one of the students we've been working with did research on cities around the country that are doing great work in the lawn to food movement. So a few cities in that space are Austin, Texas, Boston, Massachusetts, Cleveland, Ohio, Sacramento, California, and Seattle, Washington. And if whoever asked that, I think Maury, if you want to be in touch, she's done case studies on each of those, and we could share more detailed information with you as well.
Great, thank you. Let's turn to ag again now. I'm going to direct a couple of these to you, Elizabeth. One is what research is underway to understand soil health and soil sequestration in our non-grass or agricultural dominated landscapes. I think that's, you're going to love that one. And then of course, there's another question here about how the soil assessments looked at the soil health factors and whether or not soil food web microorganism analysis was done, including fungi, bacteria, protozoa populations, et cetera.
Okay, so first of all, the way that we're measuring soil health is with the Haney soil health test, and that uses a composite formula that includes soil respiration, soil organic carbon, and soil organic nitrogen and ratios between them. And what it's basically measuring is the activity levels and amount of soil microbes in your soil, how many there are, how much food there is for them to eat, and then how much nitrogen they can supply your other growing things with to make things like proteins and DNA. So that's how we measure soil health, is with the Haney soil health test that gives us a score. So then the other question, I think, was about whether we are measuring things that are not grasslands and not agricultural lands. Is that right?
I think they were thinking that this was primarily about native grasslands, and how are we looking at non-native grasslands and agricultural lands?
Okay, so in this, we tested 96 sites last year in 2019, and about 130 this year. There were about 21 grassland sites. We had about I think it was about 8 sites that were up in the mountains, forested sites. And then the rest of those sites were agricultural fields. And the agricultural fields included tilled fields as well as pasture, dryland and irrigated pasture. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so. Just for that particular question, so that you know, we're actually looking at soil health in both native grassland areas and in the agricultural context. And in that agricultural context, there's sort of multiple efforts underway that include Elizabeth's work, which is more of a private citizens effort, and then the city is looking at its own agricultural lands, and actually the county is looking at its agricultural lands too. So there's a lot of robust work now starting to take place there. I did want to also respond quickly to a question that's come up several times. Is Boulder trying to lower water use? And the answer is we are trying to conserve water use as much as possible. Boulder has been blessed with very abundant water resources because of actions taken over 100 years ago to secure water facilities and rights way in the watershed. However, even with our abundant water situation, we're recognizing that we all have to be thinking about water conservation in this context of rapidly sort of gyrating extreme drought, extreme water situations. So I think that water conservation is really a critical thing for everybody now. Wanted to swing now back to the well, while we're in the issue of cows, you've obviously touched a very interesting nerve, Elizabeth, when you brought forward the cows issue. Some people are noting in the questions that cows have had a uniquely favored role and right in the American West, especially for many years. And then many note in the comments that that's had some very significant impacts. So some folks are asking, like, well, what if we introduce buffalo? Or should we really be thinking about bringing cows back or emphasizing cows if we know they're creating these impacts? So what are you really talking about, Elizabeth, here? Just more cows, or what are you talking about?
I think we need to figure it out. I don't think the answer is totally clear. Buffalo are an interesting option, except they require massive, massive fences. And they are not something you can move easily from one location to another if you need to change grazing locations. Buffalo tend to kind of do more what they want to do rather than what you want them to do. And so I think there are, in our project, we've got growers who have cattle, horses, we've got sheep, goats, pigs, chickens, all sorts of different grazing animals. And I think we're trying to figure this out, how these affect the soil's health. I think there was a question about how do the methane emissions from cows kind of pencil out with the soil that the carbon that they can sequester in the soil. And I don't know the answer to that question. I think there's lots of folks at CSU who are working on that. There's interesting stuff going on with things like trying to add biochar to cattle feed to cut down on methane emissions. There's a lot of kind of interesting stuff that people are doing. And I think, you know, it's sort of like the same thing with all this climate change stuff. We're all working really, really hard and really fast trying to work on this extremely compressed timeline to do something that's going to help. And everybody is sort of scrambling to try and figure out these answers.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I'm going to switch back to the climate side, Matt, and come back to you. As a climate scientist, watching these longer duration trends, what are you watching for, and what kinds of new developments in information or analysis technologies do you see coming forward that are going to help us better understand what we should be looking forward to in our area?
Well, I don't know about new technologies. There's a lot of information we already have that we're getting more extreme. So think of this, in a climate changed world, in a warmer atmosphere can hold more moisture. So when the ingredients come together to make precipitation, there's more moisture available. That's how you get those high extremes. But it also means the atmosphere can hold on to that moisture without making clouds and rain in between these situations where you get storms, which is why dry periods could be longer. And more importantly, with warmer temperatures, your evapotranspiration rates are higher. So we're having a situation where even though droughts aren't necessarily longer in all situations, and the annual precipitation might not be changing a lot, the way the precipitation is distributed, and because you have hot and dry combined, droughts become more severe, and then you can have more like flashy storms, the ones that produce very heavy rain or snow. I mentioned earlier that the latest 30 years, there have been some notable changes from the older Boulder record. And even though we can't directly compare because of some of the problems with the older record, the latest 30 years is about 12% wetter than the previous 30 years. The 30 years that was 1961 to 1990, older climate site, was 12% drier. I think that was mostly because of the way the measurements were made. There was missing data. I don't think there's a lot of climate change signal. But what I did do is, if there's no climate change signal, you might expect that if the whole year is getting 12% wetter, maybe each month should be about 12% wetter. And that's not what we see in the last 30 years. June and July have actually gotten drier in the last 30 years than the older record. And if I think about what Elizabeth was talking about, where moisture is one of the most important variables for soil health, here you have the high sun season, June and July, where you're getting less rainwater into the soil. January through April have gotten noticeably wetter, even wetter than that 12% change. So I think there is some climate change signal we could still tease out from that longer period record that is real important when we talk about soil health and replenishing moisture in the aquifers and the soil, where the late winter to mid-spring is getting wetter, but the early summer, when evapotranspiration rates are highest, early to mid-summer, we seem to be getting drier.
Yeah, Jeff Lucas, who was one of the authors of the 2014 Western Water Assessment Report, just did a new analysis of fuel moisture levels. And I think one of the things that we now heard a lot from the firefighters and fire managers from this last round of fires was this sort of remarkable phenomena of how quickly and how deeply dehydrated these landscapes become, and that can happen faster now than before because of, like you say, these increased temperatures, increased evapotranspiration rates, that the landscapes may have more water early in a year, but then they dry out very fast, and then some become super volatile.
Yeah, the term being used for that is flash drought. It's not just here, it's all around the world. We're seeing flash droughts where they develop very quickly.
Right. So swinging back to the, okay, how do I think about this in my own backyard, literally? And some people are thinking like, well, I'd really like to do more about how my backyard might participate in this new sort of approach to landscaping, but maybe I live in an HOA. And how do I deal with the fact that my subdivision or my HOA has rules that want landscapes to be in that sort of very much more conventional way? So for the master's team, did you have any insights about this when you were doing your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So for our capstone, we partnered also with Resource Central, and they do lawn transformation projects with garden in a box and lawn removals. And with them, we looked at their map of lawn conversion sites. And many of these sites happen in clusters where they've noticed that neighbors are seeing their neighbors do these projects and they look beautiful and they want to do it. And then their neighbors want to do it. And so we end up with these neighborhoods that have little clusters of lawn transitions. And we've linked this trend to an opportunity with neighborhood groups like HOAs, where HOAs could develop contracts with companies like this, and it would have huge benefits of one, creating a network of sustainable landscapes. Strong and complex networks increase resilience. And two, it would allow companies like Resource Central to do more projects and increase their lawn conversion capacity because they'd have to spend less time moving from site to site if a lot of their sites were all in one specific neighborhood. So there is definitely a huge opportunity to incorporate neighborhood groups like this.
And Mara, are you seeing a shift in attitudes around this kind of landscaping?
Well, to address the HOA question first, we ran into that pretty quickly in our pilot year. There's one HOA in town where there are a number of residents who are eager to have food gardens replace their lawns with food gardens, and the HOA rules prohibited growing food anywhere that might be visible to neighbors. And there are no fences, so everything is visible to neighbors, and they could not convert more than 200 square feet of their lawn into anything else. And so there's some real limitations. California actually made it illegal for HOAs to limit growing food for personal or donation uses. And so I think there's some real opportunity to shift the mindset. And again, this is deep. This is about lawns are about achieving the American dream, right? So there's some really deep psychological work to be done around what is beautiful, what does, success look like, what's tidy, is food beautiful, things like that. And so I think there's huge opportunity and also a lot of challenges there. But I would say that, a number of our micro farms are in front yards, and there are signs that go up that say, we are growing food for this community. And I think that is our greatest marketing tool. It's neighbors telling each other. One homeowner we worked with said they set up a couch out by their garden because so many people had questions about it that they just wanted to be available to answer those questions as people walked by. And so it's a huge conversation starter. It's a way to build more resilience within the communities. And I think it's once one person in a neighborhood, as Patrick was alluding to, does it, it gives other people permission to do it. And I do think it is a way for people to kind of signal their values in a meaningful way to their neighbors and make it, kind of give them permission to do it as well, because it isn't, these gardens don't necessarily look like people are used to seeing tidy gardens look. They're different. But I think the people being able to watch the seasonal change and eat the food and have their children know what ripe tomatoes look like and taste like, I think does inherently change mindsets. Yeah.
Can I add one thing? There are some benefits to lawns. They help to cool the surrounding area. They, as Francis kind of alluded to, they are probably one of the least labor intensive per square foot landscape treatments that you can put in, besides just a weed patch. And so there are some benefits to lawns. If your HOA wants to keep the lawn, a couple things that might help would be to keep the grass a little bit longer. If the grass is longer, the soil temperature is lower, the grass can create longer, deeper roots, and it helps to shade the area. There's a little bit less moisture transpiration, and it can sequester more carbon that way. You can also make sure that they're using a mulching blade and leaving the grass clippings in place, which will help feed the microbial life in the soil. And the other thing is to talk to your HOA about applying compost to your lawn, a very thin layer of lawn, raking it in the late winter, early spring. That's similar to what EcoCycle is doing with their project with homeowners that is still open to people to participate in if you'd like to participate in their experiment. It's a really great citizen science effort that they're doing with local homeowners. So those are things that you could do on your own lawn.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I wanted to make sure I did call out that we are so delighted that so many of you have joined us today, and we hope that you'll join in, if you're not already, and many of you I know already are, participating in these different initiatives that are taking place. So one of them that Elizabeth just noted is that EcoCycle, who originally recruited 250 households to participate in their backyard carbon farming effort, has expanded that. So I think they're still taking another 200 or so families into this next round, and you'll get training in one of these kind of leading edge land assessment tools called Land Potential Knowledge System, Land PKS, which you can basically load up on your phone from the App Store. So that's pretty exciting. And it's a great way. We're actually thinking about expanding that initiative into something called Gardens to Grazing Lands, which would be starting to build a data set from inner city or sort of inner Boulder gardens out to the grazing lands, all on this common data floor so that we would be able to compare data. So there's lots of ways like that that you can get involved, and we look forward to that, having you involved. I want to call out a question for you, Sharon, that came out as an example of something that I know you've been thinking about, which is, are there other trends that we might want to be monitoring? I know one that came out in the conversations even before today was wildfires and so on, but one that came up in the discussions here is are any researchers looking at our groundwater aquifers?
Great. Yes, thank you. And yes, we are really eager to move forward with planning for this next ecosystem trends report, not only perhaps following up on some that are reported in this particular edition, but thinking about additional trends or new trends that we can report. And so the question about the aquifer, there's a group at CU that's studying the Boulder critical zone, which is the zone from the vegetation all the way down to the bedrock, essentially. So that's a group that has no doubt good data on groundwater and something that we could pursue for this next report. So I love these suggestions. That's really helpful in thinking about how we craft the next report.
I also just want to call out that there were a number of questions for folks who are living in the foothills or even higher in the mountains who are concerned about learning about and watching these trends in their landscapes as well. So I would again encourage all of you to keep bringing those interests forward. They're logged from today's conversation. I think we do need to try to figure out how to be looking at the landscape's character from, you know, valleys to the mountaintops. So absolutely there. So we're coming up close on time. If you have any last questions that you want to post in, make sure you do that to the question and answer piece. I want to just start to kind of set this up for the next steps here. As I've said, this isn't just about passively reading information. This is a community, as we all know, that prides itself in taking an active role and having an opinion about just about everything. And so we're counting on you to be very actively involved in this ecosystems area. The next webinar in this series that will pick up 2 more of the trends being analyzed, watershed health and air quality, will take place Tuesday, this coming Tuesday from 11:30 to 1. And then the third webinar in this series, which is essentially the third part of this biannual ecosystem summit, will be on Thursday, the 19th from 4 to 5:30. And that will cover biodiversity and urban land cover. And so just, I want to make sure I bring us home to why we've been doing this. We are living in, as we all know now, this year more than ever, a period of change. I think that for the last 20 or 30 years, we've talked a lot about sustainability, and we could sometimes persuade ourselves that we were, you know, on a path to having a sort of perpetually sustainable world. I think we all know now that there are certain things that have kind of come home to roost, and that there are changes taking place that are about the need to make more fundamental systemic changes in a lot of ways, how we relate to the land, how we relate to energy, how we relate to each other, racial justice, social justice, land justice. And that as we live through those changes, we're going to need to try to figure out how to chart a course towards a more sustainable future. And that's what this work is all about. And that's what the work as our community is all about. We've always been a community that, because of our foresight, our abundance of resources, both natural and financial, that we've often taken a leading role in trying to help find a path so that others would have a path forward. And so it's vitally important that we all continue to be very involved and opinionated, but especially now in this time where it's so difficult and there are so many challenges that we're all facing, to try to approach this work with some real spacious openness of difference in opinion, in approach, in experience. You know, the issue of cows is a great one. Like, people have very strong views of the role of cows in landscapes. And some people would say they should absolutely be totally gotten rid of, and other people should say that they're the most integral part of land management. And the truth is probably somewhere in between, and we need to find that truth together. So I look forward to meeting many of you. It's, again, so exciting that over 100 folks are on this call today. I hope you'll be able to attend the other presentations that are coming. And I just want to, again, thank all of our panelists for taking the time out today, all of you who've joined, and again, especially to Sharon and her team and the remarkable folks at CSU. I do want to make one last call out. I work for a remarkable organization at the City of Boulder. I work for the Climate Initiatives Department, the Parks Department, the Utilities Department, the Open Space and Mountain Parks Department have all been very active in this work and will continue to be so. So know that you have a lot of really committed public servants working with and for you, and looking forward to meeting all of you in this work. So Sharon, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Brett. You did an outstanding job moderating this discussion, and I really appreciate all of the wonderful questions and inputs. And we've been able to answer, I hope, most of the questions that you raised, but I will also save those questions and try to respond to those later. So thanks again to all of our invited guests, and especially to Brett for doing such an excellent job moderating. We really hope to see you on Tuesday from 11:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. for the next webinar that will focus on watershed health and air quality with a new set of invited guests. And then Thursday, November 19th at 4:00 p.m. on biodiversity and land cover. And again, with a new set of invited guests. That one will be moderated by Karen Bailey, and Tuesdays will be moderated by Amanda Carrico. Thanks to you all for joining. Really appreciate your participation, and have a great Saturday.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.